closely with the UN by some very distinguished economists, three of whom actually worked as UN staff members, and the others closely with. There's Arthur Lewis. And I want to now make 2 points. One, where exactly did these ideas come from? And if they gain traction, why? And I also want to then give you a balance sheet when you put them together, as we have in our book. Where does the UN stand? Positive, negative, or otherwise? The first point I want to make is that there's actually 3 UNs, and often it's the second and third UN that have given, helped many of the ideas take off. There's the first UN, the formal UN of governments. There's the second UN of staff members. And more than in most governments, UN staff members often have opportunities for taking initiatives, which are not always there in governments when the ministers have often got dominant power. You don't really have ministers in the UN. You have executive directors of different agencies and divisions, and they indeed have opportunities for taking initiatives, and sometimes do not. But the first UN of governments rarely has a sufficient and close overwatch of the second UN to control them in the way that government ministers can do with civil servants of governments. And then a key issue which we debated for a long while before eventually we made it a major theme of our final book. There's a third UN. A UN of experts, a UN of members of commissions, and non-government organizations. And often these groups have not only been closely associated with the UN, but they've often pushed for action. For example, the human rights that I mentioned at the beginning, for all. It was actually the churches, it was the Jewish groups in the United States, even before the UN was founded, that said, if you want our support, which the Americans were seeking from the NGO world, you've got to have more in the charter about human rights than had been in the Dunbarton Oaks first draft. And similarly with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CRC, the Rights of the Child. In all of these further instruments of human rights, it's often the third UN that has played a critical role. So we feel if you want to understand the UN for the past, you need to take account of the role of the 3 UNs. If you want to be thinking about the UN for the future, you've got similarly to think of the 3 UNs. And the 3, as we've shown in this Venn diagram, have often overlapped in their influence, and when all 3 have overlapped, you've often had a powerful mobilization of international action. We also looked at how do ideas gain traction. We've talked about and we've focused on the intellectual history of the UN, but we've had to face, yes, but how do ideas go from something written down or something talked in a UN meeting to something that actually has changed the world? And we identified 4 key areas. Ideas have changed the way issues are perceived. As, for example, we've explained with environment. We look at the world now differently, in part because of the role of the IPCC, or in part because of the different UN reports on environment. So development is now seen in a much more sensitive way to issues of environmental sustainability. Second, IDEAS have redefined state and non-state interests and goals, and thereby set agendas for action. Governments themselves no longer look at many issues of development because they've been influenced by the way the UN has talked or written about these issues, and governments have begun to raise questions then, so what should be the agenda for action in this area of environment, in this area of gender, in this area of accelerated development or adjustment? Thirdly, as I've said with the third UN, IDEAS have mobilized coalitions to press for action, and NGOs, the third UN, are a key example. And fourth, IDEAS have become embedded in institutions with responsibilities for implementation and monitoring. I'm interested that this institution, the ITD, owes in part its origins to UNCTAD. UNCTAD was an institution set up in 1964 in the light of some of the issues of trade and unfair trade that Louis Emery spoke of. So you have then an institution to carry forward the ideas. And the only other example I'll mention is the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. That's a very interesting idea because it was first proposed in 1947 by René Cassin, who said we need an institution to carry forward the issues of human rights, even before the Universal Declaration had been completed. Well, it's an example of how you have to push and wait and mobilize and never lose hope. That an idea first identified in 1947 then finally gets enough support in 1993 at the Vienna Conference to become agreed. The Office of the High Commissioner was set up, and there have been, I think, 4 High Commissioners since, including Mary Robinson, the former President of Ireland, to carry forward the ideas. Now let me just end by looking at the balance sheet of the UN's contributions. And we've got positives, we've got negatives, and we've got a summary. Again, I'm not going to read them all out. You can see them, and if you want to follow this up, go on to our website, you'll find more. But you'll see that, let me focus on number 4 so as to mention